competitive and non-competitive inhibitors. They might test you this on the Mcat, so let me explain them to you. Starting with the first inhibitor, a competitive inhibitor. Now, what is a competitive inhibitor? So a competitive inhibitor is going to compete with another substrate to bind to an active site. So it's going to compete for that same position, that same shape. It's going to try and fulfill it, and it's going to compete with another one. An example of this is something like penicillin. This is a competitive inhibitor, which prevents a substrate from binding to its site. Now, a competitive inhibitor is going to increase Km, and thereby it will decrease affinity. This is very important. So now let's take a look at a chart of a competitive inhibitor. So the blue line here has a competitive inhibitor, and the black line does not. So we can see that the blue line is asymptotical to the black line, meaning it essentially has the same Vmax, but it doesn't. So you could say for this example, it does have the same Vmax. It gets so close to it. It's almost there. It's almost the same exact Vmax. Very important to understand for competitive inhibition. It's going to have the same Vmax. And also don't forget, higher Km is going to have a lower affinity. The last thing for the competitive inhibitor quickly, if you see a linear chart like this and it's intersecting, that means it is a competitive inhibitor. But if it's not intersecting, then it's probably going to be non-competitive. Now, moving on to the non-competitive inhibitors. These are going to yield the same result as no inhibitor at all, since it does not compete. So a non-competitive inhibitor is going to disable the enzyme by changing the shape of the active site. Now, because of this, there are going to be fewer enzymes available, and because there are fewer enzymes available in non-competitive inhibition, you're going to have a lower Vmax. So let me represent this in a graph. Now, looking at the graph of a non-competitive inhibitor, the non-competitive inhibitor is going to be represented by the blue line, and the black line are just regular without any inhibitors. So the Vmax here, as you can see, is going to be decreased, but the Km is the same. And very important to mention that this is going to be called the allosteric site. So if you ever see allosteric site in a question, that means they're talking about non-competitive inhibition.